Hey, welcome back, everyone. I'm here again with Neeshee, Pandit of Astrology.com, and we're continuing our discussion mainly right now on Ayurveda, the basics, foundations of Ayurveda, with the goal to transition into how Ayurveda and Vedic astrology, how they intertwine, and how these things are really meant to be practiced together and how they support each other. The previous video, we discussed generalities, broad generalities of the five-element theory. And in this video, Neeshee is going to discuss the three aspects of prana, how they come from the five elements and what their importance is in this process. So welcome back, Neeshee. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Ryan. Good to see you too.
Yeah, that shirt looks familiar. Didn't you wear that last time?
Yeah. Yours looks pretty familiar too.
Yeah, that's true. All right. So the three aspects of prana. Again, try to remember many people don't have the same training you do. So when we're thinking about the three aspects of prana, what is it and what is the importance of it before we get into the specifics?
Okay. The three aspects of prana. Now, this is a really interesting concept, also a unique concept as far as I've encountered it. My Ayurvedic teacher, who I studied with after I graduated from the California College, was Vaidya Ramakant Mishra. And he put a lot of emphasis on this idea of there being three aspects of prana, which you don't find in traditional Ayurvedic curriculums. Usually it's just five elements, and then you go straight to doshas.
Right.
Okay? So this is actually a really important concept that I valued a lot from him. And you do find it in some traditional texts like the Bhav Prakash, and there's some other texts, but you mentioned P.V. Sharma was an Ayurvedic scholar who also mentions this concept. But it's a unique concept to this lineage as far as I found it. But the concept is straightforward. Prana has these three apparent components to it. Now, in talking about components, before I even discuss those components, it's really important to understand that that's a very figurative kind of discussion. You know, prana doesn't really have three different, literal components in that sense, but it's a way of discussing the different modes in which prana interacts in the universe and in the human body.
Right.
Okay, because prana is a diverse dynamic. Energy manifests in various polarities, yin and yang, etc. That's more or less what we're about to discuss.
Okay.
So that doesn't mean there actually are three pranas. There's only one prana. That should just be always clear, no matter how much we pick apart within that.
Okay, so there's one prana, there's three aspects to the prana, but once we finally get a little more deeply into the actual Ayurveda and how it functions in the body, there are like five pranas that are often talked about Ayurvedically, correct?
That's right. There's also those five pranas.
So are those five pranas the sub-pranas of the one prana, and are there sub-pranas of those five pranas?
There are no sub-pranas to the five pranas.
Okay, good.
But those five pranas are a sub-prana of vata.
Okay, excellent.
And we will encounter paradoxes, and people should not be afraid of paradoxes. Just
really?
Put that out there.
Paradoxes are the bane of YouTube speakers everywhere, because someone is going to call you on that paradox. So maybe let's take a little side here and say why you should not be afraid of paradoxes. I can come up with my own Zen-like reasons, but what's in the mind of Neeshee here?
Because everything that is significant to understand about anything ultimately is found in a paradoxical expression.
Okay.
This is just how the universe is, how life is. Life can't be understood in black and white. Life is very, very gray, and there's a huge spectrum. Mm-hmm. And when you try to compare different bands of a single spectrum, sometimes you feel like it doesn't work.
Right.
But if you zoom out far enough, you see how it all works, but how sometimes it seems like there's all these contradictions and paradoxes.
Right. Now, I think there's a couple important points you made there, and the first one being that oftentimes paradoxes are, number one, resolved when you zoom out far enough. Mm-hmm. Just like when someone is kind of paying attention to why their life is a certain way and they can't understand it. But mm-hmm. if they were able to see, figuratively with the eye of God, then that small person's life might make sense in regards to the larger scheme of things. But it's hard to the human mind can't quite attain that. And the other idea that came out of that is that we're using words here. And so this is the best that humans can do, using words to explain certain things, which ultimately may be bigger than what words can point to.
Exactly.
Right.
And when you're talking about these kinds of things, in a physical manner, you're inevitably going to find there's just endless amounts of differences in everything we're talking about. But at the level of energy, all these things we're picking apart is totally homogenized. Mm-hmm. So it's important for people to learn to contemplate and consider these concepts, in a meditative fashion as well as an intellectual fashion. Both are important.
Right. So we're coming down from the 5 elements to the idea of prana. So before we get into those specific 3 aspects themselves, what is the tie-in from the 5 elements to this idea of prana?
The tie-in is that in terms of the 3 aspects of prana, they are made up of 2 of the 5 elements.
Okay. And which 2 are those?
So, well, each of them is made of 2.
Each of them is made of 2. Okay.
Well, one of them is made of 1, but the other 2 are made of 2. So.
Okay. All right, great. So then the tie-in is that we have this idea of prana. There are 3 aspects to that prana, and each of these aspects are created by a pairing of 2 of those 5 elements.
That's right. And if people have watched the earlier video, they'll see that I was grouping some of the elements together.
Right, such as space and wind, and then fire is in the middle, and then earth and water.
Exactly.
On the other side of it. Okay.
So these elements flow together, and the description of how they flow together, or how they crystallize themselves in process, how they are dynamically alive, is what we're going to call the 3 components or aspects of prana.
Okay, good.
So the first component of prana is, well, we should do it in the right order. So the first component is Maruta, which in standard English is Marut. But for those picky pronunciation people, I will give you the Sanskrit pronunciation, which is Maruta. Okay?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Yep. Which only means space, basically. Okay?
Doesn't mean lightning.
Does it? It could mean lightning, too.
Okay.
Sanskrit words, you never know, man.
Yeah, okay.
We're going to use it in the meaning of space.
Okay.
And especially that aspect of space which flows. So it's very similar to the air element, but we're not talking about air element, okay?
Okay.
We're talking about Marut. Mm-hmm. And so that's really important, and that's going to be space and air elements make up that form of prana. And what is that describing? It's simply describing the aspect of prana which flows.
Okay.
The flow itself, free of polarities, okay? It's not hot, it's not cold, it's not yin, it's not yang. This is just the flow itself.
Okay.
The moving, flowing aspect of prana is Marut, and it's made up of space and air elements. And the next one is Agni. Mm-hmm. Okay? Agni is just made up of the fire element. Now, when you go into dosha, some people will tell you that Pitta is made of fire and water elements.
Right.
Both. But we're not going to worry about that concept right now of like the notion of the water being tied in with that. That requires a whole other discussion. But in terms of the 3 components of prana, fire is the Agni. That's it.
Okay, fire, Agni. Got it.
And that is the expansive, transformative, metabolic element of prana. Because prana also has this function in our bodies. It's not just movement itself. It's movement that transforms things. It's movement that consumes things. It's movement that digests things. Mm-hmm. So it's
like the idea of that power of consciousness which takes your food and turns it into your body, or that power of consciousness which takes a thought or idea and turns it into a realization for you.
Exactly.
Okay.
This is the alchemy of life.
Right.
And the alchemy of life is heavily dependent on fire. Mm-hmm. So there is that process, right? Because we grow, things change, things move from one thing to the next. what we are now is very different from when we were 10 years old. That's largely due to fire element. So, you know, we didn't like add anything to our bodies. Our bodies is the same thing it started out as, right? But it's transformed.
Right.
So that's that aspect of prana which transforms, metabolizes, consumes, ingests, etc. Then we have Soma. Soma is earth and water elements, the heaviest elements.
Okay.
Okay, so where Marut was the lightest elements, Soma is the heaviest elements. So Soma is made up of earth and water. This is the dense aspect of prana. This is the aspect of prana which is meant to remain in place as nourishment, not meant to be, this is not the aspect of prana that transforms anything. This is the fuel for that transformation. Okay, it's like the oil that allows the ghee lamp to have its flame.
Okay, so when you're thinking about these three aspects, these three ideas of prana, you mentioned that your one of your teachers put a very big emphasis on this differentiation. So from that perspective, why the emphasis, and what did it help you to learn or understand about prana as a general idea or concept?
What it helped me understand was that we typically talk about doshas in terms of the individual physiology. And at that point, we're already at the human scale of things. But what I appreciate about talking about three aspects of prana is that we're actually getting to see something more about how doshas are reflected in the cosmic scale of things. Okay? So it's not just that 5 elements suddenly become doshas. There is this way of talking about it that describes how doshas exist cosmically.
Okay.
Which is as these 3 aspects of prana. Those 3 aspects of prana, when they flow in the human body, are known as doshas. And you'll see the same makeup. Air and space make vata, fire makes pitta, earth and water make up kapha.
Right. Okay.
So similar concept, but here we're getting a macro concept of that same idea. That's important to understand because the source of the doshas is in our atmosphere. In that sense, cosmic atmosphere. And these relate to planets too, which we don't have to get into now, but we can.
Sure, might as well. Let's pepper a little bit of.
Okay.
We're going to do it. We'll probably do another video getting that a little more specifically, but just let's do that a little bit. When you're thinking about planets, how do these things relate?
It relates because I guess that's what really caught me about it when I first learned about it, because it was described in direct association with planets. My teacher would describe it that when he would quote traditional verses, like in the Charaka Samhita, it says, Chandravai a Somaha, which means that the moon is Soma. And I don't know the verses for the other 2. That one's just stuck with me. But it also describes that the sun is Agni. Okay. Now, I never found a description of a planet correlating with Marut, but I think Jupiter is a good correlation, and I will qualify that later on. Maybe there is a traditional reference, I just don't know about it. But anyways,
right.
The sun and the moon were always very clear. And if anything, Marut was just this kind of neutral, flow itself, not identified with anything in particular. Right. But we're going to connect everything astrologically eventually.
Yes.
Now, if you look at the Vedas, they also have a lot of focus on Agni and Soma as deities. And if you really want to understand like the worldview of the people who wrote the Vedas, it's very astrological. So what they're talking about is the sun and the moon, deified.
Right.
And in Ayurveda, it's a similar concept that the planets are a major source of prana. Where we're getting our energy from, the atmosphere that's affecting us most directly can be seen in the planets of our solar system. So in other words, it connected the whole idea of doshas with the cosmos and even with planetary bodies. So there's this solar force, there's this lunar force, and then there's this flow itself. And I think that's important. It's going to become more important as I kind of unpack that later on.
Right.
But I don't know if there's anything more I should say about that.
Well, when you're thinking about, we'll save the in-depth for that future video that I've got here on my list. But when you're thinking about, these ideas of prana and the 3 aspects of prana, when someone is learning about this, in a way, how are they going to apply that when they're thinking about maybe an Ayurvedic a situation Ayurvedically, health situation Ayurvedically, or even astrologically? How does it tie into like thought processes to help people understand their life better?
Instead of looking at somebody and saying, oh, this dosha is high, that dosha is high, what we really want to do is make sure that what makes up those doshas is in an appropriate quantity in them. So it's too late when you just look at doshas. We want to see, does this person have enough Soma in their life? Is this person getting enough Agni in their life? Whether that's through food or through their activities, through their lifestyle habits, through their astrological combinations in their chart that predispose them. If they have a debilitated sun, they're not going to be somebody who has a lot of Agni in their life, okay? Now maybe they have an exalted Mars, who knows, right? Don't take this as this generality as an all-encompassing definition. But you can see those things. And then you can work with it at that level and say, look, what we really need to do is not just remediate the dosha. We actually want to supply the flow of prana in the person in a balanced fashion and let it work itself out from there. Because if you're getting healthy amounts of Soma, you're getting healthy amounts of Agni, and the flow is happening, you're going to have balanced doshas, more or less.
So then maybe this will be tied into our next talk on prana to the doshas, but each of these, Agni, Soma, and Marut, for the three aspects of prana, is it such that each of those relates in a particular way to each dosha? Like we look at each of those for a particular dosha, or is it just?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, Soma at the human scale becomes kapha.
Right.
It's like the raw material that gives rise to kapha.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's save that for our next talk, because that's what I have here next on the list, is looking at prana to the doshas. But before we conclude to move on to the next talk, what would you really like people to understand or share or take home from this idea of the three aspects of prana, from your own experience, your practice, or even what your teacher had? What did your teacher stress about the importance of this?
Basically, that you need to have enough of all of them, and they need to be working properly. If you don't have enough Soma, you're not going to be nourished enough. If you don't have enough Agni, you can't make use of all the Soma that you have. And if you don't have Marut, then nothing's going to be moving at all. And then it doesn't matter how much Agni or Soma you have. So these three work together, and if you look at things in that way, you're getting more at the root of it.
Mm-hmm. So when we think of, like, just for an analogy, if we think of Soma as being like the fertilizer or the nourishment for a plant, and the Agni is the ability for that plant to take that nourishment and transform it into the body of the plant, and the Marut, again, this is a new concept idea for me in this regard, is that more of the ability to have the space for that nourishment to turn into something, to grow into something? Or am I thinking about that correctly?
You are thinking about that correctly.
Okay.
But also, the ghee lamp is really a good metaphor.
Okay, let's hear that.
You need the oil, which is the Soma, in order to give rise to the flame, which is the Agni. But you also need to have that motion, which allows the spark to occur. Mm-hmm. If you just have oil in a wick, it's not going to ignite on its own. Mm-hmm. You need that catalyzing force. That's Marut. That's space. Right.
Okay. All right. I see. And that vaguely sort of ties into the idea that I had about Marut with lightning, and as being, I think, part of the whole idea of Rudra. So, all right, that makes sense.
Right. You're very right about that. And that's why I'm connecting it with Jupiter, but we'll go into that later.
Right. Well, there's other reasons I think it makes sense with Jupiter. I mean, if we have Agni and Soma, and it's the idea of the polarities, and when we think about the planetary friendships, Jupiter is the only planet that's a friend
to both of them.
Yeah, to both of them, but also he's not an enemy to anyone.
Anyone, exactly.
Right. So ideally, when we see Jupiter influencing anything in a chart, no matter what it's related to by ascendant or lagna, it's still going to have some kind of supportive influence towards it, to hold the space. Like you said, with the elements and the idea of, I think, ether and space being like the womb was the same thing. I don't know if we talked about this when we were at Ernst, but someone described to me one time the idea of compassion. And having Saturn on my ascendant, I always had difficulty figuring out just what compassion really meant. And he described, yeah, and he described it to me as, I think he said that the word compassion comes from a root that's of Hebrew origin, which means to be womb-like, which essentially means to hold space for things to grow. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting way of thinking of the idea of compassion. So Jupiter, compassion, this whole idea, I think it ties together, at least in my mind.
Exactly. And Jupiter is exalted in the moon sign.
Exactly, right.
You know, so there's lots of ways to really understand. So as soon as you have this concept of the three aspects of prana, the way it connects with planets and how it's like the macro dosha, you really have a paradigm, I feel, for understanding Ayurveda and astrology better, but also of understanding Ayurveda better, which relies so heavily on the concept of doshas, but really understanding what those are and where do they come from.
Right. Yeah, good. All right. Well, we'll conclude here with that thought. And in our next talk, we will discuss the idea of how prana kind of becomes the doshas, or the relationship of prana to the doshas.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for being here again, Neeshee, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Ryan.